So for this week's class, we're going to be learning about the first civilizations of the world. So together we'll have a total of 8 classes, and all of these classes will be going through all of the largest societies and civilizations of the world. So today, of course, as the first class, we'll be talking about the first civilizations. Down the road, we'll talk about other civilizations that you might have heard of. Maybe we might talk about the Roman empires, the British Empire, and even the Mongolian empires in the future. But today, we're going to start off with the first civilization. And well, let's start off with a very simple question for everybody. Does anybody know what a civilization is? And if you know, please raise your hand. I see Lyndon. Would you like to give an answer?
Civilization is a group of people who live under a set of rules, and basically.
Perfect. So you touched on a really important point there. A civilization has to start with one thing. And that one thing is a group of people. Right? Without this group of people, there can't be a civilization. And the other important point that you touch on is that you have to move by rules. That does not necessarily have to be true, as we can see from the start. But yes, there has to be some mutual agreement that we have to work together as a group to achieve something to benefit this community. So they must be what we call a community. All right. There's also another question on the page, and that is the topic that we're going to be talking about today. So, as I said, we're going to be talking about the first civilizations. But does anybody know where that first civilization is? Can anybody guess around which area that it is? Maybe if you have, there's a map on the page right now on the PowerPoint. So maybe you guys can take a guess.
Asia.
So let's start with okay. So sorry, was that Sean?
Asia.
Okay, so Sean guesses is in Asia. So I assume that you mean somewhere around. You mean somewhere around here, right? Yeah. Okay, that's a good guess. But let's see if there's other answers. Jasper, would you like to give us one?
Is it near Egypt?
Ooh, good guess. All right, so Jasper thinks it is near here. What? Anybody give another guess? We're getting closer and closer. Is it Yilin?
Africa.
Africa. Okay, so yeah, that's close to what Jasper's saying with Egypt being in the north of Africa. We're getting really, really close. But does anybody have more specific parts of it? What is close to Egypt, north of Africa, but not necessarily there? Stephen?
Europe.
We're getting further. We're getting colder. We're always touching around it, but we're so close to it. Let's see, Jasper, would you like to give another guess?
Mediterranean.
Perfect. Yes, you're correct. Somewhere around here. Not only the Mediterranean, but also what we right now call the Middle East. You guys might have heard of it.
The Mediterranean Sea.
Yes, that's correct. So the Mediterranean Sea, I'll use a different color. I'll highlight it. It's over here, right there. That is what we call the Mediterranean Sea. So it's around that region.
Isn't it
All right, well, I guess we'll keep going. Okay, so as I was saying, the first civilization is in the Middle East. Well, can anybody? Oh, okay, I see somebody in the chat already get the answer. Yes, that is correct. It is Mesopotamia. But can anybody tell me why you think it is at that region? Why do you think it is so important to have the first civilization, or it is possible to have this first civilization in that center region of the world, near the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and also North Africa? Does anybody have a guess on that? Why what is really important in that region that makes it possible for there to be a civilization? Lyndon, would you like to give a guess?
Because there was like a lot of water there, and like grass and place for planting crops.
Perfect. Okay, so Lyndon just gave a really good answer. Yes, it is really important for it to be near water. And yes, as Emily said, the most important part of this is rivers. Because what are rivers? Well, rivers are fresh water. And what is fresh water? Well, it's something that we need to drink and use to survive. Because, well, you can't really drink ocean water. It's way too salty and it's not good for the human body. So that's why rivers are really important when we try to create a civilization. All right. Another reason that I will give right now, but it isn't as important, is because of the locations of where the first human beings evolved as part of evolution, and that was part of Africa. The reason that most civilizations are still around, I would say, this region, is because of its climate. Um, we most of us live, I would believe, live in Canada, a very cold place in the winter. Well, back then, we didn't have these houses that we can live in. We didn't have heaters. We didn't have anything. Most people just had a fire in the center of their village, and that was something already really precious because most of them didn't even know how to create fire, and that was only discovered during like the first settlements or the first little communities. And well, it is only possible then, if we can't create any constant heating, to live in somewhere that is pretty warm, and that is somewhere near the equator, which is, well, the line you see down the middle. That is roughly where the equator is, and usually people lived around that region because of the temperature, and it's more comfortable to live there, and it's also necessary for farming. If it's too cold, you can't really grow a lot of crops. All right, I'll take some questions before we move on to the next page. Sean?
The line is an imaginary line.
Great, yep. Just so for anybody who doesn't know, an equator is kind of an imaginary line. I'll write that. It's an imaginary line that we just think about to kind of perceive or to see where the middle of the earth is. And usually that is like the point that is the closest to the sun. Because as everybody knows, the world is spherical. And while the point in the middle is usually closest to the sun because it's a sphere. And that's why it's usually the hottest. And it's also the most tropical. So very damp, very humid. So a lot of water in the air. And yeah, hot enough for the temperature to be pretty warm throughout the years. All right, perfect. We'll move on to the next page. So, as I believe it was Emily who guessed, the first civilization or the first group of civilizations that we were going to be talking about is Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia by itself isn't really one civilization. It is kind of this group of civilizations near this region where we call the Fertile Crescent. This Fertile Crescent is the place that most of the Fertile Crescent is where we call Mesopotamia. So why? So why is it called Fertile Crescent? Well, this part, which is really near the Mediterranean Sea, as we see right here, this is the Mediterranean Sea, is Mesopotamia. And the reason why it's called the Fertile Crescent and which Mesopotamia lies on is because, well, first, the crescent is near a lot of rivers. And secondly, because the crescent is near a lot of rivers, there is a lot of a certain mineral in this water that is very, very important to farming, to growing plants, growing a lot of different things. And well, what this material is called is silt. Does anybody know what silt is used for? Does anybody have a guess?
Did you say silk?
Silt. So it's S-I-L-T. It sounds really similar to silk, but they have different usages. And I can tell you this silt affects farming. But how? Does anybody know? And again, the silt is a mineral or material that is found in the water. Yep, Lyndon?
I think that mineral goes into the crops and then it makes them grow.
That's correct. Yeah. So what does silt do? Well, silt makes dirt fertile. It makes the dirt very fertile, which means that it makes this dirt really rich, so that whenever you plant crops on this dirt, the crops grow really fast and they can produce much more compared to plants that do not grow in silt-covered dirt. And this silt, again, is coming from the rivers. So that's why this part is called the Fertile Crescent, because when there's a lot of rivers, you get a lot of silt. And I guess going a bit deeper, silt is just this is the mineral that usually is on the bed of rivers. And when rivers run, when they move, they bring it up onto the soil and they stay in the soil where people usually plant crops. Right. So this picture of Fertile Crescent, you can see stretches from the Nile, which is where Egypt is. So this part is kind of Egypt, and you have Mesopotamia. You can see there's a lot of rivers. But unfortunately, this only works back then. There is something that happened throughout the years. There is a satellite image that came out in 1992, so 20 years ago, and they saw that 90% of this fertile dirt, so this silt-covered land, disappeared because of more industrialization, opening up new channels for boats to go through, so they have to dig larger rivers, and this destroys all the land. So almost thousands of square miles of these like very fertile dirt that can be used for planting plants and crops have all become deserts and just stand because there is no silt and there's no water running through them anymore. And yeah, just further on that, around 200,000 people around this area nowadays have lost their homes because of this mass exploitation of these river channels. All right. Any questions about the Fertile Crescent and about the planting of crops? Yes, I see Lyndon.
Do we have silt in our nearby rivers?
Actually, we do, but the levels are different. So we can see how much silt. Of course, in every river, there is a certain amount of silt that stay in the river. But what is great about Mesopotamia is that there was so many rivers and there was such a massive amount of the silt within the riverbeds that it made it really, really prosperous. So it's very easy to grow a lot of plants. But in North American rivers, unfortunately, there is not as much silt. And as I said, the temperatures are a bit more extreme. So it's more colder in Canada. So it's harder for these crops to grow. That's why even though there is silt in the rivers near us in North America, but usually these rivers are not used to plant crops. All right. Any other questions? Yes, Jasper.
Didn't the Babylonians rule this piece of like area of land.
Ah, good point. Yes, we're going to be getting to that later on. Yes, so Babylonians is a civilization that we'll be talking about that is part of this group of the first civilizations that lived within Mesopotamia. All right, I'll take one more question before we move on. And Lyndon?
Does the Mesopotamia belong to Africa or Europe?
Yeah, so it is kind of in the middle. It is in a region which is called the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. So you can see there is the Mediterranean. There's the Mediterranean Sea, and it's east of it. So it's kind of in the Middle East. This part of the region is what we call today as the Middle East. Of course, that is a new name that we've given to them throughout the last century. But before that, it was usually just called, the Eastern Mediterranean, and usually they will talk about the empire's name before they gave the name the Middle East. All right, so let's move on to that, and we can get right into the first settlements. So before we have cities, before we have metropolises like Vancouver, like New York, before we have these large cities, well, we first have to have settlements. And when there's settlements, there has to be humans. So when was the first human settlement? As you can see on the screen right now, that is the first human settlements according to
Those are
scientific
big
records.
sandcastles.
Yeah, they look like sandcastles. That's correct. I'll get to that later on why they look like that. But let's focus on when the first settlements were. As you see on the screen, it's around 14,000 BC. And does anybody know what BC stands for? Maybe some of you guys know it as BCE. Is that Blair? Blair, would you like to give us your answer?
Before Christ?
Yes, that is correct. So some of you guys learned it as before Christ. Some other people also learned it as BCE, which stands for before Common Era. Oops, sorry, I spelled that wrong. Perfect. All right, so I guess we are talking about BC. So does anybody know what AD stands for? Is that Priscilla?
I don't want to answer. I just wanted to ask if I could go to the washroom.
Sure, no problem. Go. You don't have to ask. If any of you guys need to go, you're free to go. All right. Is that Lyndon with answer?
Yeah, it's after death.
Great. That is. So we were talking about AD, which is after death. That is the most common one that people learn about today. But does anybody know another name or another meaning for AD? Oh, Emily's saying Common Era. That's correct. We do call it CE, Common Era, but that is not something that AD stands for. All right, it is kind of complicated, so I'll just write it down. Write that better. All right. So AD actually stands for in most texts as Anno Domini, which is Latin, and it basically means Anno Domini is basically means in the year of the Lord. So it is kind of like after Christ, but just in Latin, and makes a bit more sense. All right. So let's get back in. Let's get back into the first settlements. Well, 14,000 years ago, the first human settlements are created. This period of time is actually called the Paleolithic Era. So the that's not an 8, that should be an oh, sorry. The Paleolithic Era. So what is the Paleolithic Era? Well, the Paleolithic Era is the era of the first human settlement. And in this kind of period of time, the earliest humans lived in caves or simple huts, as you see on the screen. And back then, they didn't have a lot of what we call common jobs or jobs nowadays. People back then were hunters and gatherers. So what did they do? Well, they would hunt for their food, or they would gather berries and other fruits as their diet. So they didn't have any trades and nothing fancy like money. Well, that is, as we're saying, the first human settlements. So after kind of the Paleolithic era and nearing the 14,000 to 9,000 BC, we will have what we call little human settlements or human towns. These towns have housing, as you see on screen, that formed communities. And these communities usually did two very large things that they invented. Domestication of animals, so having animals such as cows, sheep, dogs that lived near them that they can use to farm for food or to trade, and also the development of agriculture. So the development of agriculture, thanks to the Fertile Crescent, made it possible that these people were able to grow a lot of crops and make food themselves instead of going to gather and wander around just to get their food. All right. So we have a question from Sean.
Do they use fire?
Yes, of course. So fire was actually discovered before this period. So 14,000 BC is where people actually started coming together. They started farming these small communities, these very small settlements, small towns, as you can call them. And yeah, so they of course had fire because we know that there are hunters and gatherers. Of course, if you're hunting for meat, hunting for food, you have to have a fire, or well, you can't really cook your food and you can die from a lot of diseases. Yeah. So, Lyndon, do you have a question?
Do these like gigantic sand castles still exist today?
Unfortunately, not. Especially with newer buildings that got developed over time, different empires conquering different places, the need for these lands, these were one of the first buildings. And well, these don't exist anymore because there are better buildings that can be built. So yeah, these buildings were actually made out of complete clay. So they're solid clay and usually, so basically the first basic cement. They will take this really wet sand and they'll mix it with water, which forms this gloopy kind of clay, kind of like Play-Doh. And they would make this kind of wall. And well, they will start building this kind of rectangle shaped base, and they will start building this pyramid like top. And well, this is all made out of this wet clay. And when the wet clay dried, this is what you have, and it's a very sturdy structure that is really easy for people to build because they didn't have a lot of tools back then. So that's why this is the type of buildings that they built in the first human settlements. Yeah, as Harvey says in the chat, these aren't really the most efficient house buildings, and they're not always the best, especially if it's really hot, because you're basically living in an oven because there's no way for the hot air to come out. All right, I'll go on to answering some questions before we move on to the next slide. Is that Yiling?
How do you get this picture if it doesn't exist anymore?
Great question. So the original houses don't exist, but because scientists have to learn about these old houses and how people lived, they would recreate these houses, and they will usually recreate them out of the same material, and they will go through by themselves the same process to see how these people did it. And of course, if sometimes if you don't have access to these houses, most of these old civilizations are what we use, or what are made by what we call CGI, so computer generated images. They're all digital. So I'm not sure if you guys have an iPad at home, and you try drawing on a digital iPad. That's the same effect, but just on a more professional grade. And they do this as a business. All right. Next, Angela, you have a question?
How come there are like holes in the roof? Like when it rains, doesn't it like go through like the house?
Great question. So yeah, yes, you see there's holes on the roof. I can point them out for those who can't see them yet. Those. So what those holes are for is to regulate temperature. As I said, it gets really hot indoors, right? Because all of the hot air will blow through and there's nowhere to go. So well, these holes help let some hot air escape and some cold, fresh air to get back in. And usually in these regions, there's not a lot of rainfall because, as I said, it's very humid and it's a very hot place. So it is pretty dry. But if there was rainfall, you can see that the slope is slanted. So most of the rainwater will just fall down and not drip into these holes. But if there is some problems that water got in, it will be a very minimal amount of water. All right. I see Lyndon with another question.
Well, what's those baggy things on the top?
So, you mean these?
Yeah.
Right. So those are either decorations, or they're used as kind of a very stiff top, just to make sure that everything is structurally sound. Because usually you can see there's these clay structures, but usually if they can, they'll mix some like really hard stone inside it to make it stronger. So yeah, these are either for decoration, or they have the purpose of kind of giving it a very symmetrical top where the water can flow more easily. And it just looks cooler sometimes. All right.
It's actually for like the structural like make it better, because the sticks will go in the clay, which will make the clay a little more sturdier.
Yeah, that's correct. So usually people will cover that up. As Harvey said, it is for structural integrity at its main purpose, but usually people will cover it up. If you see like teepees, a lot of the more indigenous tents, you have like this kind of top. But some places will cover it up, and sometimes some places will keep it open. Another reason to keep it open is actually to act as a chimney. So if you cook food inside, well, you need another place for the smoke to get out. So instead of just relying on these two holes, they usually will have this top that is empty that lets the air and the steam escape, but still protects it from water and rain. Yeah. All right. If there's no more questions, we'll move on to the next slide. All right. So after talking about the first settlements, we're going to be now talking about the first city, because that's kind of the next step up. Oh, the first city within Mesopotamia is the city called Uruk. They might have different pronunciation back then, so I'm sorry if I'm not the best at pronouncing these type of names. So what was Uruk? Well, Uruk was kind of this mud brick metropolis. So metropolis as in a very large city. So it was made out of mud bricks. As I said, a lot of sand, a lot of clay and mud is very integral to building these type of structures, because back then they didn't have cement and they didn't have a lot of wood to build with, because it wasn't as they didn't have the technology to know how to properly build with wood to make it very structurally sound. And you can see this is another computer recreation, so CGI of the city Uruk, and you can see it's actually pretty massive, right? Yeah, so that was one of this first cities, and it looks very massive. It looks very beautiful. And yeah, it was made out of mud bricks. You can kind of see in the middle, the taller your houses, the more power you had within society. And this was kind of the first human city where people could walk around, they can buy things, they can trade, and have their own lives within like the safety of a brick wall that is the city. Right. So there is some very specific things that are very special to Uruk. Well, they had a lot of things that we think should be something that is very modern. They had public art. So they had art museums, they had art galleries, they had gigantic columns. So you can kind of see they're like gigantic pillars that would just look beautiful and sometimes don't do any jobs, just for show. And also, very importantly, temples. So they started to build up religion, because whenever you have a religion, you need a temple for worship and everything. And by building a temple, it's very important to know that building a temple isn't a really easy task. Compared to the houses that are only one level from the last slide, these houses are much more complex. They're multi-storied, and they take a lot more architecture and planning to create these buildings. And yeah, Uruk as a city at its peak, so at maximum capacity, they had 50,000 people living there, which is very impressive considering back then it is very hard to build sky rises and everything. And within this pretty small kind of city, you had 50,000 people. All right. Questions? We see Eileen with another question.
There weren't much wood. Is it because it was too hot to grow trees?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
There wasn't much wood because it was too hot to grow trees.
Yes, that is one issue. And well, first of all, they're living in a desert. They have enough dirt and silt to plant crops, but they don't have enough to plant trees, because trees take a lot of water, they take a lot of nutrients, and they take very long time to grow. And while working with wood isn't really easy, they're very fragile, and it takes a lot of effort to kind of cut this wood to make just a wooden plank. So that's why they didn't like to build with wood, and they're too fragile because they didn't know how to work wood properly. All right.
And then it is very flammable in like such a hot place.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it was just a better material to build with mud, even though it's heavier. They had enough people and workers back then that they can make these like large buildings of these like really solid material. All right. Let's move on to Lyndon with the question.
Can plants live in the mud bricks?
Can plants live in those mud bricks? I believe there were some maybe some agricultural farms that lived within the walls of the city, because well, it's a city, so they had to protect all of their citizens. And of course, there were people that grown potted plants, if that's what you mean, within these like mud bricks. All right, Angela, you have a question?
Why are there so many walls?
Very good question. Well, these walls are usually for separation of different parts of the city. Well, you have, of course, the parts where you have trade happening. You have the more residential parts for people to live, and you also have the part in the middle for worshiping, so temples. So they create these like kind of separations of blocks to show the difference of what that kind of block is made for. And while having more walls isn't always a bad thing, because if anybody invades, you can kind of retreat back into a inner wall. And we'll see later on that because this land was so fertile and you can like grow a lot of crops in it, a lot of different civilizations and cities would want to fight for it. All right, I'll take one more question before we move on. All right, does Harvey have a question?
Yes. The
All right.
question is like, there's this weird thing right over here. Why is there so much people here, or are those just clay structures?
Oh, okay, yeah. Those are actual people. So, again, this picture isn't real. It is part of a computer simulation or a computer graphics. And yeah, these people, there weren't that many people back then. And usually people line up for that for mostly two reasons. One, for worship, or two, for a very big announcement. So because there were religious people, usually they would line up to go in to celebrate. All right. All right. So with that being said, we're going to move on to the next page. So we're talking about the Sumerians, and I didn't really touch a lot about the Sumerians, but if I missed it, Sumerians are the group of people that own the city Uruk. And again, it's around that 3,200 BC where Sumerians kind of completely took control of Mesopotamia and established their dominancy by building the first city, Uruk. And one more thing before we move on, for those who are interested, Sumerians also invented the first earliest form of written language. So the reason they had to have this written language was because they lived in a city. There's a lot of things going on and there's a lot of people. So they had to keep a record. And to keep a record, well, you need a written language. That's why they had their first written language around that region, and one of the first languages in the world that is written down. All right. So we talked about the first written languages and the first city. Well, when there is a city and there is written language, there has to be entertainment. People get bored, and there has to be something that they want to do. Well, back then, they didn't have video games, they didn't have TV to watch. What they did back then with the written language was they had books.
Jester?
Yeah, Jester was actually later on, and it was really expensive for people to get Jesters. So most people, common people, would usually get books. And back then, books were chiseled by hand on a stone block. So they're actually not cheap either, but they're better than having a Jester. And the first earliest great work of literature was called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Yeah, so the Epic of Gilgamesh was one of the earliest literatures and one of the greatest work of literatures in the ancient times. And some people even say that the Gilgamesh was in the Epic of Gilgamesh actually inspired some of the stories and some of the stories or some of the things that you hear in the Bibles, because it was one of the greatest and most known work in the ancient times. So yeah, a lot of people read this literature. And well, some of you guys may ask, what is an epic? Well, an epic is a story that is in the style of a poem. So it is a fiction story that you guys might read, but it is in the it's in the words of a poem. So it reads more smoothly and it sounds better. All right. Questions from Angela?
Why is it that thing like stonish?
You mean the piece of literature on the right side? Why is it stone?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
like why is it like that when you like if you can't read it? How do you like read it though?
That's a good question. So, well, all of these marks you see are chiseled, right? Because it's chiseled on a piece of stone. They didn't have a lot of paper back then. They didn't know how to make paper. Well, so what they had to do was they had to chisel these words into the stone. And of course, you guys think, well, that's just gibberish. That is just random carvings within the stone. Well, back then, that was their language. So unfortunately, we don't understand that language anymore, or most of us don't. If you're not into this, like maybe a historian might, but we don't read this anymore. So we think it's just gibberish. But if you give it to somebody who understood the language, they would think, yeah, this makes complete sense. All right, Lyndon, you have a question?
What does it say on it?
Specifically on this stone, I'm not sure because again, I'm not a historian, so I don't know how to read this language. But this literature is very famous, and if you just search it up online, there is a translation into English for this work of literature. All right, any more questions? I'll take one more. So Harvey, do you have a question?
My question is, what why don't they just make it carve like a rectangular shape with that, and then literally just sort of make a book with a few pages made out of stone, and and there aren't there these giant cracks in there? Wouldn't and so if one got cracked, wouldn't like the whole entire story be ruined?
Yeah, that's
And
correct.
can they connect? Is this whole entire thing be able to connect to other things? And how do they copy it?
All great questions. So I'll start with the first one. How can they make a book? Well, they really can't. They just have these really huge stone slabs with maybe a page number marked on it. So they finish this one giant slab of writing, we'll move on to the next one. And well, yeah, you're correct on your second question that it does really break easily. And what happens when it breaks? Well, unfortunately, you can't read that page anymore. So they had to be very careful with these because it was very expensive to make, and it was actually really fragile because stone actually can crack if you drop it or something. So yeah, so that's why literature was usually reserved for the upper class people. So anybody who had a lot of power or was really rich within these cities, they got to read these literatures. Yeah. Did that answer your question, Harvey?
My last question was, how do they copy it?
Oh yeah, sorry, I missed that. So they didn't copy it. They had to chisel everything by hand. So if they want a second copy of it, they had to go by hand, and nothing was actually copy and pasted. So they had to create new copies every time somebody wanted to write or read it. Because the first copying machine, so the first not copying machine, printing press, where they can mass produce these things, was actually created in the 1700s, 16, 1700s, where they had the first printing presses, where they can actually print individual letters onto a piece of paper. And while back then they didn't have printing presses and they didn't have paper, so all they had to do was chisel all of these words onto this piece of stone. And they had to do this every time they wanted a new piece of literature. All right, let's move on. So we've talked about the first literature, we talked about the first cities, we talked about the first settlements. And well, what else is really important in a society? Of course, it's the laws. Without laws, you don't have a community because everybody would try to cheat the other person out and nobody would cooperate, and there is no rules to follow. And that's where the Babylonians stepped in. So the Babylonians were the group of people that came after the Sumerians with their first city, Uruk. So after Uruk and their city, the Babylonians came in as the next kind of very impressive civilization within Mesopotamia. So the first law of society was invented by Babylonians. Let's talk about the Babylonians first. Babylonians were actually a very impressive empire, and this society of Babylonians actually really treasured their kings, and they thought kings and queens were very important. And one of the most famous members of the royalty was a king called Hammurabi. And why was he, which ruled over 1792 to 1750? This is actually, well, why was he really important? Well, because of two things. First of all, he really expanded the empire. He had a very great vision for the Babylonians and really wanted to expand his empire. So he was constantly at war and constantly gaining a lot of territory. So the Babylonians was actually one of the first large empires that we know of. One of his most famous contribution within society, though, is his list of laws. He created the first written laws. So before him, most of the laws were actually spoken. So people just talk to each other for the rules, for the laws. But no, for Hammurabi, he actually wrote down the laws that he want people to follow. And this book of laws was actually very famously called the Code of Hammurabi.
Wait, what's his name?
Yeah, so his name is
Okay.
Hammurabi. So the code is kind of named after him.
I mean, like, you're saying it a little fast. I can't really hear it.
Hammurabi.
Can you type it in the chat?
Sure. So King Hammurabi. I can also write it down on the page. So give me a second. So his name was King Hammurabi.
Does he have a last name?
He, unfortunately, because this was so long ago, this is around 4,000 years ago. Most people don't know don't know his last name. So, as I was talking about King Hammurabi and his Code of Hammurabi. What is really important about this was that not only did he write the laws for society, so he wrote down what people can do and what people can't do, but he also made sure that there were governors in different areas. So he was the first person, because of his large empire, he knew that to become a good emperor, he had to split up the different parts of his city so people can govern different parts. And he had to make sure that these governors or these people in power can't act on their own. They had to have a vote, they had to consult other people, and to make sure that their decision was right. And that was very important because it made a more just society. And the list of laws, or the Code of Hammurabi, was also very important because it gave some suggestions on on punishments that citizens should receive. So it recommended punishments whenever citizens broke a law, and this actually made sure that every citizen has the right to the same justice. So everybody was treated equally when they did something wrong or committed a crime. All right. Any questions? If your question, you can raise your hand. If not, we'll move on to the next page. Lyndon, you have a question?
Do they have money back then?
No, not money we know about. So the money we now know is, well, paper money, right? This money, it technically has no value, but the government says it's worth $10. Well, it's worth $10 now. Back then, they either traded goods, so they had to do what's called uh, they had what is called, this is a more fancy term, it's called the barter system. Basically, if you have something I want, I'll trade it with you for something for something you want. So basically, maybe a cow for 2 sheep, a sheep for 2 pigs, something like that. So there was no currency involved, but yes, there was trading. All right. With that, let's move on. So maybe when I talk about Babylon, nobody knows what that is. Maybe most of you guys don't know. But if I talk about the Hanging Gardens, or one of the 7 wonders of the world, most people will know, oh yeah, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And of course, Babylon for Babylonians. So the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was one of the 7 wonders of the world. And although the actual location of the gardens isn't found, most researchers believe it was somewhere around Mesopotamia, around the time when the Babylonians were in power, according to ancient writings and a lot of literature. So specifically, people believe or estimate that the gardens, the Hanging Gardens, was built in 705 BC to around 681 BC. And this was very, very impressive garden, because this was a garden that used some very, very, very modern agricultural techniques that they thought they didn't have back then. So what was the garden like? Well, the garden was actually a sloping structure. So it was kind of this temple that that got smaller and smaller as you reached the top. And there was water that would flow from the top down to the bottom, and it would irrigate or water all of the plants on each of these slopes. And although people didn't know how that irrigation system worked and how they got the water up, it was a very, very, according to the literature, something that was very, very novel, something that was really new, and something that wasn't seen before. And if the literature was right, it deserves to be one of the 7 wonders of the world. Well, can anybody else name another wonder of the world? I'm just curious. Nope. Right. So if I say it, maybe you guys will all know. So another 7 wonders of the world that you guys probably might know is Pyramid of Giza in, of course, Egypt. But unfortunately, although it's a 7 wonders of the world, it's not part of today's lesson because it is not within the Mesopotamian region.
I wrote one in the chat.
Oh, that is a good guess. The Roman Colosseum. Unfortunately, that they don't count that as one of the 7 wonders of the world. But yes, that is still a very impressive building. All right. Any other questions?
What if there was like something like how do they wouldn't there be like annoying pests to go and eat like the agriculture?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Harvey?
Wouldn't there be like pesky things that would want to eat the plants?
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. Well, there are these insects everywhere, right? But unfortunately, back then they didn't have pesticide or things that can kill poisons that can kill these insects. So that is one reason why they needed a place that was really fertile and can grow a lot of food, because some maybe 10%, 20% of the food isn't edible because of these insects, and that's why it made it even harder for people to grow food and grow enough food. Ah, yes. I see Yunin send me an answer for the Great Wall. That is correct. That is one of the what we call one of the new 7 wonders of the world. But the Pyramid of Giza and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon is part of what we call the one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They were kind of the first 7 wonders. But yes, the Great Wall of China is one of the 7 wonders of the New World, and considered, of course, as one of the wonders of the world. I see also Taj Mahal. So I'm not exactly sure. But I believe that the new 7 wonders of the world it does not include the Taj Mahal. Oh, sorry. It does include the Taj Mahal and also the Colosseum that Angela you've talked about. So you got both of those correct. They're part of the new 7 wonders of the world. But those are because they're newer constructions in around 12th century, 13th century. They're not part of this group of the 7 wonders. All right, perfect. Any other questions before we move on? Nope. Okay. So the last topic we're going to be talking about today is the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was considered one of the last empires of Mesopotamia because before the Europeans took over, before other powers kind of dominated this part of the land and was no longer called Mesopotamia. The first Persian Empire was founded around the 550 BC, and it was founded under a person called Cyrus the Great. Well, why was his name Cyrus the Great? Well, back then, when people have names, it is usually named after something that they did, and for Cyrus, so that thing that he did was really great. So maybe you guys have heard of another person that has the name the Great in them, which is Alexander the Great, which we'll talk about in future lessons. So, why is the Persian Empire so important? Not only are they the last empire of Mesopotamia, but they were also the first world superpower. So they dominated not only Mesopotamia, but a lot of the Middle East and a lot of the Mediterranean. So nowadays, Turkey, Italy, those parts. They stretched a lot of really far, not just in Mesopotamia, and they had a lot of reach within their empire. So that's why they were called the first superpower. When we say nowadays superpower, we usually think United States and China, but back then, the Persian Empire or Persia was one of the superpowers or the first superpower of the world. And just some places that I can name back then that they took control of was one Mesopotamia, Egypt, and also into India. So you can see how far the reach is and how much land they had to conquer. But unfortunately, the Persian Empire was defeated by Alexander the Great, and that kind of marked the end of the Mesopotamian Empire or the Mesopotamian era. All right. Any questions about that? Nope. Oh, Angela. Answer.
Like, what happened to like the parts of the Middle East dominated by the Persian Empire after Alexander the Great like defeated?
Okay, good question. So what happens after they got defeated? Well, they had to give up that part of land, right? So all of that land had to be given up to Alexander the Great and his empire. And yeah, that kind of ended up Mesopotamia because Persian Empire started in the Mesopotamia, but they got defeated by somebody that was an outsider to Mesopotamia. And yeah, I don't want to talk too much about Alexander the Great because that will be a topic for next time. All right. So with that said, that is the end of and yeah, if you have any questions, hang around and let me know. But if not, you guys are free to go, and I'll see you guys next week, same time and same place. All right, bye guys.